Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bracket U. I'm Brian Tonsoni. Josh Wilson is the guest today, and it is championship week where either championships tournaments are rounding up or they're just beginning in the bigger conferences. And Josh and I will take about 45 minutes to discuss the impact of the conference tournaments on the bracket and the seeding lines of the teams involved in the bracket. Josh, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, Brian. It's a beautiful Monday in the state of Indiana. We got our hour back yesterday, and like you said, it's championship week. So it's like I preluded last week. It's the greatest time of the year, and we kick it off tonight with the SoCon Championship, and I believe is it the Western Conference semifinals. Gonzaga's on later tonight. That's always a fun conference tournament to watch out there in Vegas.
You know, some people say that this week might even be better than the first round of the NCAA. I don't know that I buy that, but there is a ton of basketball on starting this evening, and North Carolina Greensboro gets a 2-0 start as we are recording this on Monday night. Some implications with the bracket in these small conferences. You know, if there's upsets, then a bid might be stolen from some of the mid majors, and I know that's important to you and I. What are your thoughts? Is this week better than the NCAAs, or would you still say the first weekend of the NCAAs is more enjoyable?
I would say the first week of the NCAA tournament's the best. I always take that week off from work, especially now that you have kind of the first four play in over in Dayton. So you get games Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening, and then Thursday, Friday. It's from like noon to 10:30, and I mean you can't beat that. I mean it's certainly some fun basketball to watch, and it's truly do or die, win or go home. And so you get 12 hours of continuous basketball, and it's nonstop. I got one game on the TV, one on the computer, maybe another one on the tablet, and just keep flipping back and forth. It's a basketball fan's dream.
I tell you, March is incredible for basketball here in the state of Indiana with the high school tournament going on. And then I have to agree, the NCAA tournament for me is just prime viewing. But the championship week has been special. And ever since the last 4 years that we at Delphi Bracketology have been involved in trying to select the tournament seeding and bracketing, you start learning the procedures. And boy, this week really becomes important. And so a couple of things to our listeners. The seeding procedure is for the entire body of work this season. And so we must remember that one game this week is basically 1/32 of a resume. Some games will obviously help, some will hurt, but it's not a major moving event with a win or a loss this week. Some teams have put themselves in a position where it's a lot more important than others. But one of the things that we've learned, Josh, is that you can't just sit here and determine the whole season's seeding and a team's outlook based on 2 or 3 games back to back to back here at the end. I think early on in our time, we put too much emphasis in the conference tourney. The committee is meeting tonight and tomorrow and Wednesday, and generally by Wednesday or Thursday, they have a good portion of the tournament already selected. And then they just start planning their seeding, and they save the last selections probably Friday night, early Saturday. They have the field selected. So there's your championship games on Saturday in some of the big conferences, the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, and the Big 10. The semifinals haven't even been played. And the bracket is almost complete by that Saturday morning, short of maybe a last couple of teams that they're considering to put in. So by that time, that a lot of people say if a team wins a championship or gets to the championship, what's their seed going to be? That might be already determined. And that was a little bit of a shock to us that the conference tournaments are more of a seeding thing than a get you in thing. But they're still fun to watch, and they still have some impact.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely a ton of fun to watch. And like you said, it's more about, the seeding's already done because, the smaller conferences those games have already been played. So if there's a team that, that wasn't an at-large bid that, steals a bid, they're probably already on the seed line somewhere, 15, 16, maybe 12 at the most. But yeah, it certainly is a great time to sit back and reflect. But you don't want to get too much recency bias in it. Maybe like a team like Kansas or Virginia. They've done a ton of work so far this season. If they lose to whether it's Iowa State or Virginia gets clipped in the semifinals or the quarterfinals of the ACC. That they probably lost to a good team, at least a team that's in the tournament for the most part. So there should be no bearing on that, and I'm glad the committee doesn't take that into a large account.
So as we go on, and Delphi Brackets has tweeted out some things, we hate to say lock because a lot of things can happen, and it's a bunch of teams in comparison. But we think if you're on our 1 through 8 line, you're pretty much safe. If you're on our 9 line, those are Iowa, Minnesota, Ole Miss, Seton Hall, relatively safe. I know a lot of people have Minnesota a lot lower than us. We are higher on Minnesota than a lot of teams, so we might be missing the boat there. But once you get to the 10 seed line, TCU, Washington right now is in because they're the leader of the conference. If they don't win, they're going to be in jeopardy. Utah State, Syracuse, Temple, St. John's, Arizona State, Ohio State, Indiana, Creighton, Clemson, Belmont are all teams that we have in, but this week could be important, at least the first game. Alabama, North Carolina State, Florida, North Carolina, Greensboro, who's playing right now. Those are the main competitors to move in to our bracket from outside, where the conference tourney early games might be important. You have some outliers like Memphis, Oregon, Xavier, Georgetown, and Providence, who have some good quality resumes that might get in. So the bubble is kind of, I said earlier, 20 teams for 7 spots. It's probably more like 13 or 14 teams for 7 spots. And those are the things that need to be focused on. The rest of them might be a seed or two, or a seed line, or just an overall spot or 2 adjustment in the tourney. Josh, what are you looking forward to this week? I know you're a Big Ten guy. Let's start in the Big Ten tourney. And obviously our Hoosiers have a big game. And if you'd get started explaining that, and then anything else you're looking in the Big Ten.
Yeah, it's certainly a big game both for IU and Ohio State. Ohio State's coming in on a 3-game slide right now. Obviously, you have to take into consideration that Caleb Weston was suspended for those 3 games, and I'm sure the committee will look at that as well. So I have Indiana and Ohio State kind of neck and neck, and obviously you and the kids do as well, kind of in the bracket info here. That's going to be a huge game, a lot of implications. I think, if Indiana wins, they get to 18 and 14, they get another shot, obviously a good quad 1 win opportunity against Michigan State for the 3rd time. If Ohio State wins, Indiana's going to sweat it out till Sunday. It's going to be tough for them to get in at 17 and 15, I think, unless there's really no bid thieves. So a lot on the line for both. And I honestly think the Big Ten tournament's just so special, just because, especially in years like this, there's going to be a ton of teams that have opportunities to really make some noise. Even the teams that play Wednesday, there's a couple of them that can really get loose. I tell you one team to really look out for, they've been hot lately, is Penn State. They open up against Minnesota, and I think we agree there. I think Minnesota's in the field. They've got a good resume. They've got some good wins. They've had a solid year. But Penn State can make some noise, certainly coming through that bracket. So this is probably the best the field has been in a long time, and I really can't wait to watch the Hoosiers play Thursday early afternoon and just watch the tournament. It's probably one of my favorite conference tournaments to watch. A little bias there for fandom, but I think the Big Ten's got some of the best basketball in the country.
I think the Ohio State-Indiana game is almost an elimination game. I think Ohio State can lose and still possibly get in because they've lost the last 3 games due to their best player was suspended for 3 games. And I think they can survive that. They have 4 quad 1 wins and 4 quad 2 wins and a lot of road wins in those quality wins. So, but I don't think Indiana can survive a loss. I just think their horrible streak during the January and February run has got them to where a lot of people don't think they'll even make it with 2 or 3 wins. But I think Indiana is very close to being in with the win. I think everyone else is pretty much situated. I don't know that the tournament's going to change a lot. Wisconsin's hanging on to a 4 seed. If they get beaten their first game, they could possibly get past, not because they lost, but because someone in the 5 seed range does make a run. That's when some teams fall. I think Purdue's pretty much etched in a 3, although Kansas is sitting at a 4 with a really solid record, but they've had injuries and defections on their roster. I think the committee is going to be cautious with them. I think Michigan State are locked in the 2, although some people have, a Michigan dropping down and LSU moving up. But boy, there's some interesting things with LSU as well. I agree with you on Penn State. I don't think anyone wants to play them, you can see them winning a couple and getting to the semifinals and making a push. I think they've really turned things around in the second half of the season. Let's move on to the SEC conference. You have teams Kentucky and Tennessee that have been fighting for the top of that conference and for the number 1 seed, but neither of them won the conference. It goes to LSU. Your thoughts on the SEC championship tournament?
That one's generally top heavy. I think it's got a little more depth this year, and it's going to be exciting because obviously Tennessee is full of a bunch of old guys. They kind of play Rick Barnes kind of rough and tough basketball. Kentucky will be exciting as always. LSU is an interesting team just because of what's going on around the program right now, and you're really not sure who's going to show up, kind of what the mentality is going to be. How much these guys are going to buy in. Moments like this, you really come together or you fall apart. I mean, obviously they were able to win and lock up the regular season championship, but that's going to be a tough situation to overcome, especially moving forward. I like Auburn. They got good guards. They weren't as hot earlier as they were earlier in the year as of late. That's going to be a fun tournament. I always forget about Mississippi State. They've had a really good year. They're at 22-9, 8-6 in quad 1. So they've got a really good resume. They can be dangerous. So that's going to be a little bit of a deeper tournament this time around, more often than it is really. So that should be good. I don't know. Kentucky's been hot, and they're on a 1 seed, so I think they do enough to stay on the 1 line. But I think they probably, them and Tennessee, well, they're probably the 2 and 3, so they would meet before the championship. So I think whoever wins out of Kentucky, Tennessee will take home the conference tournament.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting tournament run. I think LSU at the 1 seeds got the easier run in the tournament, but I do think Auburn might give them a little bit of run. As far as seeding, we've moved Auburn up lately because they've done nothing but add some wins. Before they had 0 quad 1 wins, and their quad 1 record is 3-7. It's not great, but they have 10 quad 2, and they're sneaking up. We had them as an 8 and a 9 most of the year. Now they're in the 5-6 range for us. Kentucky and Tennessee will be in the 1 and 2. Mississippi State is an interesting. We have them in the 6 range. They have 8 quad 1 wins, but the NCAA now has team sheets, and the team sheets are broken up into tier 1A and 1B. Just split down the middle. You need to be a 1 through 30 at home opponent to get a quad 1. Tier 1A is 1 through 15, and 2A is 16 through 30. Of those 8 quad 1 wins, only 2 of them are in the top tier. And so Auburn has only 3 quad 1 wins, and they have 1 in the top tier. So that's a new kind of breakdown for the committee to look at, which looks at the quality of wins, just not the number and quantity of wins. And I think that the committee will look at both. When we go back to the Indiana Hoosiers, if you look at the last 6, 7, 8 in and the first 4 out, Indiana has 3 tier 1A wins, and the closest team has 1. In fact, several have 1 and several have 0 tier 1A wins. So quality of wins matter just as much as the quantity of wins. What do you think of the LSU coaching situation, Josh? Do you think that's going to affect them in their play, and do you think that might affect them in their seeding?
Well, I was thinking about how the committee would look at it. Obviously, you lose your head coach. That's certainly got to have an effect on their tournament performance, because obviously the main steady voice isn't there anymore. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of distraction, a lot of speculation. You got to assume that the coaching staff that is there is going to do a lot to really lock the borders down around the basketball team and try to keep the outside noise out. I really think it depends on how they fare in the SEC tournament. I think if they get beat early, we might see them unravel a little bit. And I also wonder, the Javonte Smart kid, who it was rumored that he was the player in question on that the wiretap. And with him out, does the committee take that into effect, and does that cost them a seed line, or at least a couple spots maybe on the 4 seed line? it's hard telling. But I'll be curious to see how they come out and play in the SEC tournament, because I think that's going to be the first sign of, are they locked in, or has this really gotten into them?
And the only game that we can tell is a game against Vanderbilt, who had not won a game in the conference, so you really can't tell.
Yeah.
I think the committee is aware, and the committee wants to pick teams that'll be ready to play next week. And if a team is without their coach, they're going to have to evaluate LSU this week specifically for that. LSU has a 2-seed resume, number-wise, quality-wise. You could very easily make an argument for the 2-seed. But with the unknown of the coaching situation and the player situation, I think they're going to stay at the 3 to where they're at. And I think we might miss, Josh, on this when we put into the bracket matrix. I wouldn't be opposed. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't play well in the tournament, that they just drop down because they feel that this LSU team is not the team that built the great resume. And I don't know how far, but unfortunately, we have experience with it in our Hoosiers, with Sampson getting fired the last 5 games, and a certain somebody that took over. And all of a sudden, Indiana had a great record, lost a couple games, but fell all the way down to an 8 seed, and probably had a 3 or a 4 seed resume. So I don't want to scare the LSU fans. We got a couple great followers on our Delphi bracket page, so I don't think you'll see that. But it may be a 3 or 4, and if Kansas plays well, Kansas might move up to the 3 and LSU down to the 4, just because those two teams have a lot of questions right now as to who the team is. Here's an interesting tournament. The American Conference, Athletic Conference, right now we have 4 teams in, and they're the 4 buys. Houston, the 1, Cincinnati, the 2, Temple, the 3, and UCF, the 4. And we have Memphis sneakily off the bubble, not in our first 4 out, but they're 19-12, I believe, maybe 20-12. I can check that real quick. They have only 1 bad loss, and they have great strength of schedule numbers, and that's one of those teams that no one has talked about. 19-12, 3-7 on the road, 1-8 in quad 1, 2-3 in quad 2, only a quad 3 loss. Quality is not there as far as tier 1 and tier 1A and 2A, but they're a 53 net, and they play the tournament on the home court, and they are a 5 seed. And so, if they win 2 or 3, does the committee throw them in? If they beat UCF, that's the second quad 1 win. All of a sudden now I think that might be the team we every year that we go, how does the committee pick them? They weren't on anybody's radar. Your thoughts on the American Conference? A team like Houston and Cincinnati are the favorites, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I've tried to watch a few American Athletic Conference games here over the past few weeks to really try to get a grasp of how good Houston is. And I mean, they have a couple good players. I watched them get beat at home by UCF. I wasn't overly impressed, but I mean, they've had a really good year, so you can't discount that. I'm really intrigued by Cincinnati. Right now, they're on your 7 line. So, I mean, they kind of fell apart at home there on senior day, and obviously Mick Cronin had a pretty infamous post-game press conference. He's saying he was going to go ask Luke Fickell if he can have some tryouts from the football players, because that's just how embarrassed he was from their performance. So I'm really anxious to see how they regroup and kind of what happens there. But I think Houston has to be the favorite. I think UCF, I mean, those are probably co-favorites. I mean, that can probably go either way. But I think if Memphis can get a win or 2, you're gonna have to think about it, especially if some teams fall off in front of them, like a Clemson, North Carolina State, who I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes. They play each other, they face off, and they're both right there on the bubble. If North Carolina State falls off, Memphis is right there to take advantage. So I'm very eager to see if Memphis can take advantage, do their part, and maybe some other teams help them out.
Penny Hardaway in the NCAA tournament, wouldn't that be something? As a coach, you got to like the job that he's done. Houston is an interesting comparison. When you start getting to these teams that don't play in the big Power 5, 29-2 is pretty impressive. Houston might have a chance at a 2 seed. It's hard when teams have 9, 8, 11, 10 quad 1 wins, and Houston's sitting there at 5, but they have no losses outside of quad 1. Their quality numbers, 3 in tier 1A, 7 in tier 2A. I think they're solidly a 3. Wouldn't be surprised if they dropped to a 4 just by the committee. But their overall net is 4. So I see them on the 2 or 3 seed line. Cincinnati plays great defense. They always struggle for offense. And if Mick Cronin's one of my favorite coaches, he is really tough. If you go to his practice, you better have some earplugs or better not be too upset with what goes on. But he's as tough as it gets, and his teams are gritty. They play a lot of defense, but like last year, they couldn't hold a lead against Nevada, and Houston was a little more athletic yesterday. So I do like a repeat of Houston, Cincinnati. I think Temple needs to get at least a win. They're somewhat safe, and that means off the first 4 in our bracket, but a loss could be early compared to runs made by other teams, and Temple's resume is just questionable at best. I think UCF is in. They would do well to get to the semis. Yeah, go ahead.
A question about Temple, because obviously you see guys like Seth Davis or, the media guys. Really, I think they have an emotional connect because they're really, even John Rothstein said after Temple won, I forget who they beat last, maybe it was UCF, that Fran Dunphy needs to be in the NCAA tournament on, his last season. So do you think the committee really thinks about that? Maybe they have there's an emotional attachment with a certain part, that they would get more ratings from the media, attract more fan attention. Do you think that plays a role at all, especially with a coach the caliber of Fran Dunphy?
That's a great point, and the answer plain is no. And this is our 5th year of looking at it. I don't believe that they sit there and say what match. A lot of the talk is we're going to put certain players in and certain superstars in. We want them in. Well, we've seen that. Ben Simmons didn't get in, and maybe the records, I don't know, their records were under 500 or something, so it was easy for them not to do that. Trey Young last year, everyone said the reason Oklahoma got in was because of Trey Young. I don't. It's nice for Coach Dunphy to be in. I think it, but their record of 2, they have 2 wins in quad 1 and 6 in quad 2, and that's pretty good for the bubble. When you look at it, it's still weak. Like I said, I don't know that they can afford to lose in their first game, which would be to Wichita State, or Eastern Carolina. That would not be a good loss. No, I don't think they do that. And most of the matchup conspiracy theories are because of the geography charge from the NCAA, where you have to play somewhat close to home, flight miles to schedule your pods, and you end up playing teams that are relatively close because let's say a Kentucky gets placed in a pod close to the Midwest and you're a Purdue, you're going to end up going to Kentucky's pod more likely if that happens, simply because of flight miles. And it's the charge of the NCAA. It's not committee members sitting there going, boy, this would be an interesting matchup, or these 2 coaches don't like each other, or these programs had an interesting game in November, let's put them here. That's not the talk. The procedures are pretty clear cut on how they put people into the tournament. And I think the selection of teams is pretty clear cut. You have to have good records, your quad 1 wins, a good net, all of those criteria. And it's done by voting, but I don't think they sit there and say, this guy's retiring, so he automatically gets in. If that's the case, Mike Dahm from South Dakota State would be in because he was a heck of a player. Chris Clemens from Campbell would be in. A heck of a 3,000 point scores would be great media. The ESPN with Ja Morant, they could have a heyday with all the great players and great coaches. I just don't think so. We had a question, Josh, in the chat. Tyler Asher, thank you for listening, Tyler. We appreciate it. And so this is going to lead into our Big 12 discussion. Tyler asked, what is the big difference between Texas and Indiana resumes with people having Texas in and IU out? Tyler, I wish I had an explanation for you that makes sense. If we had Texas in at 16 and 14 when Texas was 16 and 14, and IU out when they were 15 and 14, because our group said you have to be at least 2 games over 500 to be considered. We flipped that. As soon as Indiana went 2 games above 500, now they're 3 games above 500. We believe Indiana's resume is good enough for them to be in. Texas' resume is good enough to be in, but they're sitting at 16 and 15. I simply don't think the committee will put a 16-team loss in unless it's just the last team available. Texas did have some nice wins, but at some point, I wouldn't, and I'm a big IU fan, I wouldn't be opposed to saying we're not putting any 15-loss teams in. But in the last 2 years, they've done that in crazy situations. Vanderbilt had a good, solid schedule and had some wins. I think Indiana's 6 wins really might get the committee's attention, and the fact that there's some injuries played a part in some of those losses. And if you just say that 2 of those results would have flipped, and you can't do that, and the committee really does not do that, but you're looking at Indiana right now being if they were 19-13 headed into the Big Ten tournament, they're locked to be in. Even with the crazy 12-13, I think Texas and Indiana's resumes are very, very, very similar. And at one point, Texas had a little bit better quality. And I know that sounds weird when Indiana's beat Michigan State twice, but beating Purdue, a 3 seed, beating North Carolina, a 1 seed. Let's say this: Texas and Indiana are very, very close. They both have a series of bad losses, and the team that figures to be more above 500 has the better chance to get in. And so I've never understood why some of the professionals, Lenardi and Palm, had Texas as high as a 9, but IU out. If you're going to have Texas in, you better have IU in, or have them both out. So I can totally see why you would keep Indiana out. Their road record, their overall quad 1 and 2 overall record is 8-14. There's good reasons to keep Indiana out. But yes, Tyler, that was a tough thing, and we'll head to the 12. Josh, you want to add anything about Texas and Indiana?
Well, Texas only has one chance. They open up the Big 12 tournament against Kansas. So you lose there, you're 16-16. There's no chance. So that conversation's probably a moot point come March 14th at about 9 p.m. That's when Kansas and Texas tip off. If Texas wins that's going to be a huge, huge, huge boost to the resume. But at that point, they're still 17-15. So they have to win out, because at some point, if they lose, they're going to have 16 losses.
The best they can be is 18-16,
yeah,
and not win the automatic qualifying.
Yeah,
and I like Texas' resume, but last year Oklahoma State had 6 quad 1 wins, and they were sitting at like 92 in RPI and didn't get in.
Mm-hmm.
And we made the mistake last year of putting Oklahoma State in based on their number of wins and didn't look at their the other criteria. The RPI was so bad last year, we shouldn't have put them in. That was our last decision, our 48th team in. We had an hour-long discussion, and it went the wrong way. It actually cost us winning the bracket matrix. We would have won the bracket matrix twice in 3 years if the vote came down 7-6 in our committee. And Oklahoma got in based on strong number of wins. And so this year we're probably a little biased against Texas because they have strong number of wins, and we're just not going to fall for that trap again in the last bit. Some other Big 12, we got a question about Belmont also, and we'll get to that. The Big 12 is tough. I don't think any results are going to really change anything. Texas has to make a run. Oklahoma, some people are down on Oklahoma and TCU. Their resumes are good enough to be in. Even if TCU loses to Oklahoma State, that would put TCU in jeopardy. Oklahoma's not in jeopardy. They don't have anything solid, Josh, but they're pretty decent. And you're just going to see if Texas Tech and Kansas State is going to win the conference tourney too, or is Kansas? I think the big story is Kansas. Can Kansas make a run a little bit to show everyone that they're really the same team that was at the beginning of the year with Azubuike and Vic? So that's the big story here. But I don't think any of those teams are going to be knocked out with a loss simply because they're tough. Anything else about the Big 12?
Yeah, kind of real quick back to the Texas subject. If you beat Kansas, and then you have to play Texas Tech, who would presumably beat the winner of Oklahoma and West Virginia. So even if you beat Kansas and you lose again, you're 17-16. There is no path for me to have Texas in the field unless they win the Big 12 tournament. I just don't see it happening. If Oklahoma loses to West Virginia, that should be an exciting game. Obviously, that would not be a very good loss, but like you said, the committee doesn't really, sit on recency bias. Oklahoma has a decent resume. The intriguing game for me is Baylor and Iowa State. Baylor is on the 8 line right now, and Iowa State is on the 6 line. So that holds some weight for seeding. So I'll be eager. If Iowa State wins, does Baylor fall? Because Oklahoma and Baylor are actually both on the 8 seed line right now.
Yeah.
So what happens with Baylor, especially if you got some teams behind them, shuffle on up a little bit. And then, I think TCU, if they lose that opener, they're right now they're kind of in the 9-10 range. That could be troublesome, especially Oklahoma State, a team that just hasn't had a real good year. So that should be it's
really good. Real on Iowa State, they've struggled, and we have a question in the chat about injuries. Injuries are taken into effect, but just how much is really unknown. Everyone has a minor injury. A player sitting out a game here. Matt Hoosier 24 in the chat says, tough for those minor injuries to be considered. A team like Clemson didn't have a 20-point per game score against a loss against Mississippi State. I think those things are shared. There are so many across the nation that I wonder how much they're really taken into consideration. Committee knows that. A 1-game or a 2-game situation. And here's the other thing. The committee can't automatically say, so Clemson had that player out, they would have won against Mississippi State. Mississippi State's a 5 seed or a 6 seed, lost with their 20-point per game scores. So you don't automatically flip a loss into the win column. What I do think is in the Duke situation, different teams. There's one with Zion and there's one without Zion. And I think everyone has to admit that Duke is much better. How does the committee look at that fairly? I think Indiana's injuries may fall into that minor situation too, a concussion, missing a couple of games, and a recovery. I think Indiana's injury thing is they had 3 major players plus 2 backup players out for a significant portion of their 7-game losing streak. And they played well before, and now everyone's back and they're playing well. So the committee can sit there and say, man, they had a rash of injuries in the middle of the season. They're not going to Indiana's not going to be a 1 seed all of a sudden because they're just going to dismiss those games. They lost those games. But if it comes down to Indiana and a Florida, and Indiana has 6 quad 1 wins, and they can say, you remember Indiana had a tough stretch there of 7 games, so we don't like their losses, but there is a reason for those losses. The individual game, North Carolina State lost a scorer in a game. That was brought up to us. I'm sure, Michigan State is an example. They beat Michigan twice with their injuries and lost to Indiana. Do you take away those 2 Michigan wins because they played without Ward and without the guard? I will tell our listeners they are taken into effect. What you try to do is figure out what is the team going to look like at tournament time. Duke and Zion need to show some things. LSU without their coach needs to show some things. Indiana with their full squad have won 4 in a row. If they beat Ohio State, those are the ways that committee then gets around the injuries. I'm not sure the minor 1-game ones have a major effect. That's a great question. Jonathan Warrener, I hope I pronounced that right, said there was a question. Let's go. Jake Wilson said, if Belmont gets in, what seed will they be? I think Belmont's an 11 if they get in. They have a tough go. I'm not really pleased with their resume. They have a couple of quad 1 wins and a few quad 2 wins, but they haven't really beaten anyone. They beat at UCLA, but UCLA was really poor at the time, and Alford was coaching. They didn't like him. If the committee wants to put a mid-major in right now, Belmont is it. If Wofford gets beat tonight, they're down 25-20. Wofford will get in. Belmont is real close, but I think they'll get an 11 seed. Your thoughts on Belmont, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of the national media guys saying that Belmont deserves to get in. My question is, why do they deserve to get in? They've won a lot of basketball games. That can't be taken away from them. They bring up the 3 top 100 wins, 2 of them coming against Lipscomb. And, outside of beating UCLA, which we have come to know is not a very good basketball team, they haven't beaten anybody. And they lost to Jacksonville State twice. So does Jacksonville State deserve to get in? So that's kind of my dilemma. And I wouldn't be, mad to see Belmont in. I think if I'll take a little bias here. If you put Indiana and Belmont next to each other, I mean, who do you put in? I mean, do you want to see the mid-major team, which is always fun, or do you want to see a top 5 draft pick with a team that's beaten really good basketball teams this year that has an opportunity to make a deep run? People will vote for both.
Yeah.
So
and
go ahead.
The thing I like about the committee is that it is in the transparency they're trying to show it, they have to have criteria, and you have to stick to that criteria. If it was just about who the superstars were or who you'd like, and then 10 people just get to vote on their favorite teams, I think you'd have a lot more uproar with the NCAA. You already have a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
But at least the NCAA committee can say, here's what we do, here's our wins, here's our losses, here's what goes in. And I think that's if there's a problem, Josh, in not having too many mid-majors, then the criteria or the rules need to change.
Mm-hmm.
But the rules say, who do you win? Where do you beat them at? Who do you play matters the most. If they want mid-majors in, save 2 spots. Say there are 2 mid-major at-larges. The football does that with the one Power 6 or the non-Power 6 conference gets one in the championship series thing. I would have no problem with that. Then you could say at the end of the tournament, here are the 2 best at-larges that did not win their conference tournament, and you could place them in and seed them then against everybody else. But you got to play people to beat people, play people and beat people in order to get in. And that goes, Jonathan Warrener, I hope I pronounced that right, said, how many bid stealers do you suspect we get this year? I think for me, Wofford, Buffalo, Nevada, Utah State, those teams are going to be in the tournament. And if they don't win their conference tournament, I still think those teams, so that's 3 conferences and 3 bid thieves that I think are definitely in. Belmont would be the 4th bid thief. I don't think anyone else. You might say the Pac-12 because they might be a 1 bid. We haven't gotten to them. We'll finish up here a little bit with them. Washington keeps sliding, and it's kind of hard to see a conference champion regular season not be in the tournament. But Washington has not beaten anyone who is in the field. 0 wins against teams who are tournament bound. They have 2 statistical quad 1 wins, but their resume is really, really, really lacking. And so there's no guarantee that Washington gets in. So if an Oregon State wins the tournament, Oregon State might be the only one in. Arizona State's hanging with a 68 net. So we can go to the Pac-12, and we got the Big East, and we're kind of running up against time. But so, man, I think that's going to be the extent of the bid thieves. I don't think Lipscomb and Furman will get in. They're interesting cases. Furman beating Villanova. They have a quality win. That's why they will get in if we're wrong. But again, across their schedule strength, 217th overall schedule strength, I think that is taken into effect somewhat by the committee. I don't think Furman gets in, and Lipscomb losing twice on their home court to Liberty, who was 63 net. I don't see Lipscomb getting in. Those are great stories. But again, they don't fit the charge that the NCAA is in. What are your thoughts on bid thieves, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a neat storyline. I think there will be a couple. Obviously, we've talked about Belmont. You got to kind of watch out for them. Wofford, who's in a dogfight right now. If UNC Greensboro wins that game, there's a bid thief because undoubtedly Wofford will be in the pack. And then you kind of wonder about the Pac-12 as we're working our way into that conference. So if Washington and Arizona State don't make it to the conference title game, do they get in? That's a big question because I think the Pac-12 we've seen anybody can lose to anybody on any given night. And then what happens, if Washington and or Arizona State, one of them makes it to the conference title game but loses? So I think that's going to be a very intriguing. I think that conference tournament is going to provide a lot of movement kind of on the back half of the field with at-larges and bid thieves. It's going to be very intriguing, especially for fans of Indiana and teams that are right there, Ohio State on the bubble, things like that. You have to sweat it out a little bit.
The Pac-12 is really going to be interesting because, Washington and Arizona State as the 1 and 2 seeds better win their first quarterfinal game. Arizona State's got some nice wins. They beat Kansas. They have some numbers, but they have 2 quad 3 losses and 2 quad 4 losses. And they're one of the few teams in the tournament consideration that have 2 quad 4 losses. You can go down to the Big East, which is our last tournament to talk about, and Providence, Xavier, and Georgetown are way down the list. They don't have any quad 4 losses. They have 2 quad 3 losses. So, and they have some wins. Xavier, look at Xavier, Providence, and Georgetown's quad 1 and quad 2, 4s and 5s show up. That's a conference we're going to end on next. But this Pac-12, Washington and Arizona better play each other in the championship, and then the Pac-12 will definitely get 2 in. If one of those teams doesn't make it, if you get upset by Stanford, Arizona State, Stanford in the quarterfinals, or Washington gets beat by Arizona in the quarterfinals, I'm not sure they're making it. And boy, there will be an uproar. 8 loss, 23-8 Washington left out for a 17 and 18 and 15 Indiana team. That's where it gets kind of juicy. So, hey, we got to get done here in less than an hour. We're right about 40 minutes right now. Let's go to the Big East, Josh. Talk about your thoughts on Villanova and Marquette. Seem to be faltering here down the stretch. Do they have enough to recoup and make a run in this tournament and the NCAA? And is there a sleeper for you in the Big East?
I think Marquette's got enough to really get hot. They have really good guard play. Everybody knows about Marcus Howard. They've got the Hauser brothers. They're solid. Teams that can really shoot. If they get to feeling good and making shots, they can be dangerous. Delphi Brackets has Marquette on the 5 line, so I think they're solidly in the field. Villanova can be in trouble if they lose early. I think they're in the field, but they may slide a little bit. So they have to be careful. They'll get the winner of Providence Butler. I mean, the Big East is just a jumbled mess, but if there's a team I have to watch out for, it's St. John's, just because they've been really good and then they've been really bad lately. And I think Georgetown could probably make a little bit of noise, but I think St. John's has really good guard play. Shamori Pons, they're going to play in the Garden, and there's just always something magical that happens with the Big East tournament in Madison Square Garden. So St. John's is probably a team to watch out for. St. John's and Georgetown, probably my 2 sleepers in that conference. Villanova's lost 4 or 5. I think they have to have a good showing to kind of stay on the seed line where they're at. But Marquette has the most to gain, I think, because I think if they get hot, they can carry that in and have a decent seed, the 4 to 6 range. We've seen Big East teams get hot and run to the national championship. Not saying Marquette's going to do it, but they have dominant guard play, and we've seen what Marcus Howard can do a couple times this year.
It's a guards game. You and I have talked about it. You got to have a great point guard running the show. You got to have ability to shoot the 3 to win consistently in the NCAA. And I think free throw shooting down the stretch is also important. But good guard play, when you fill out the brackets after Sunday, everyone, look for your guards if they get hot. And unfortunately, St. John's has taken a hit because Villanova and Marquette have struggled down the stretch. And that's one of the things that is not right about the criteria system that we use and the NCAA uses, is that sometimes it's what your opponents do that affect you. St. John's beats a Marquette team twice when Marquette was hot, but that's not credited. Now they look at Marquette team who's sliding to 29 in the net, and that's a little unfair to a team like St. John's. So St. John's goes from relatively safe 8 and 9 down to a lot of people 10, 11, and maybe even the first 4 out because their wins don't look as good because Villanova's in a slide and Marquette's in a slide. Madison Square Garden, beautiful facility. The Big East tournament needs to be there all the time. Big Ten, no way. Stay in Chicago. Stay in Indiana. Or Indianapolis needs to host it every year.
Yeah.
But Chicago, Indianapolis, it's a Midwest conference, and if Rutgers and those teams want to come join us in the Midwest, they can. We don't need to go join them at Market Square Arena. That's a little biased. Sorry to our East Coast listeners. What a tournament. St. John's is 7. Providence is 8. Providence has an outside long shot chance because they got some quality wins. You got Creighton, who is in our last 4 right now at 17 and 13 because they've won 4 or 5 in a row. They've got to play Xavier. Xavier had a good run down the stretch. So you got the bottom teams that have made runs and the top teams who have fallen back. There's a bid thief, maybe. Maybe not, because I think if Xavier goes to the championship game or Providence goes to the championship game, they might have earned an at-large anyway. But the Big East is normally a great tournament to watch. Really a lot of bracket implications this year. Thoughts overall about the bracket procedure? I've tried to get you up to date here a little bit in the last couple of weeks since our high school basketball season ended. Any questions for me, Josh, from you on a bracket perspective as you look at what we've done on our spreadsheet?
Yeah, I'm really coming along. It's a lot of information to take in. You definitely look at things a little bit differently. All the metrics are really neat to understand exactly how the committee breaks it down. I think I've probably gained a little bit better of appreciation for the whole process of Selection Sunday, especially now that CBS is going back to announcing them by bracket and not alphabetically anymore. Thank God. That was terrible. I'm just looking at all these teams, and I think, I want to get your, thoughts here as we wrap up on the ACC. I don't know that we dove in a whole lot with them, but I think there's a very, very big game.
Yeah, that's my bad. I have all of them listed here, and we didn't get to the ACC, which is probably one of the best tournaments. I misplaced the paper, but so let's talk ACC. Go ahead.
Yeah, Clemson, NC State. I mean, that's the 8-9 game. Winner gets Virginia. I think the loser of that game is out. Clemson is hanging on by a thread. They're right there on the 12 or 13 line. We have them. They got a 35 net. I mean, 19 and 12. They're 1-9 in quad one though. No quad three, no quad four losses. And then NC State, if I remember correct, is kind of outside looking in. Yeah, they're the second team out right now. So
their fan base thinks they're in like at the 7th spot, though.
Yeah. Well,
you could ask all the bracketologists have been inquired by NC State fans. We love you, Wolfpack, and good luck to you. But the resume is what the resume is.
Yeah, their strength of schedule is awful. They didn't play anybody out of conference. They have 2 quad 3 losses. They're 8-8. I mean, they're 6-0 in quad 2, certainly 2-8 in quad 1. But they haven't really.
They played. Yeah. There's 4 double plays in the ACC. They double played North Carolina, and then they played the 3 worst teams double played. And conference record doesn't matter, but a lot of people have been saying to me, "Hey, well, they're 9-9 in the toughest conference." Well, you played 6 games against the bottom teams, and you actually lost 1 to Georgia Tech and Wake Forest. You lost 2 of the 6 games to the weakest part of the bracket, and that's where the quality looks in too. We don't just look at the numbers. The committee just doesn't look at the numbers. They kind of know probably a lot more than you and I know about that. The big thing about the ACC is Zion. Can they make a run? If Duke makes a run, they may grab a 1 seed. Can the ACC get 3 number 1 seeds? Your thoughts?
I think it's very plausible. I mean, Virginia, they've got to be pretty much locked into a 1 seed. They've had a great year. I think North Carolina deserves a 1 seed. I mean, they swept Duke. I mean, they've lost 5 times all year. They're 16-5 in quad 1 and 2. That's very impressive. I mean, they don't have any bad losses. They're very dangerous. And I think if Duke, I'd have to pull up the bracket. So North Carolina is going to be the 2 seed. They're going to be the opposite of Virginia. So if Duke and North Carolina make it all the way to the semifinals, they'll match up again, which would be very interesting because, I'd say they swept Duke, and you kind of got to take that with a grain of salt because Zion played all of 35 seconds against the Tar Heels.
Do you punish a team for winning games on their schedule?
You don't. I never will.
And that's the toughest question because it's legit.
Mm-hmm.
Do they sweep if Zion plays? But you can't play a game on paper. You played it on the 2 courts.
Right. And Duke still has 2 top 5 draft picks. So, I mean, it's not like they went from, they went from Duke to Rutgers. And, Rutgers is a solid basketball team up and coming, but there's a very large, margin of difference.
There is a big complaint for if North Carolina gets knocked off the 1 seed line or Kentucky gets knocked off the 1 seed line because Zion comes back and they go on to win. That's going to be an uproar.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that that's fair. I mean, it's obvious Duke at full roster is the best team in the country playing well. That doesn't mean they're going to win every game, but they're the best roster. They're the best team, and they're dominant when they're playing well. So it's almost a travesty not to have them on a 1 line, even though they lost without Zion. That's going to be the committee's really tough because you got Kentucky and Tennessee who deserve consideration. Heck, Michigan State deserves consideration for that 1 seed line. So, that's another thing in the bracket matrix where we put in for the tournament of bracketology. You could do everything right, and we could put Kentucky as a number 4 seed, and they end up with 3 ACC teams in that bracket or in the number 1 seeds, and you don't get all the points that are possible, and yet you had no way of knowing what the committee was thinking. But right. The ACC is just going to be fun to watch. I think Clemson, North Carolina State is a vital early on. And other than that, I think a lot of the teams are relatively safe. I don't know if there's we always mentioned Clemson. Everyone else seems to be okay. That'll be in from the ACC, but it's always good basketball.
Yeah, well, Louisville, I mean, say so they'll get the winner of Georgia Tech, Notre Dame, which I don't think either one of those teams are very good. I mean, if Louisville slips up there, I mean, that'd be an ugly loss. I don't. Would they fall at all? Would they fall a seed line for you guys?
Here's the interesting. That's a great question because Louisville, I'm not sure what to do. They were up in the reveal, but they've lost a lot since the reveal. Starting after that Duke, mega meltdown. They're the third strongest schedule in the country, strength of schedule. But they're 4 of 10 in quad 1, 4 and 2, and they're right now sitting on the 6th seed line. But Villanova has a chance to go above them. Cincinnati has a chance to go above them and has been above them for a while. We had Louisville at the 7 for the longest time. So a loss like that might be enough to drop them just one spot. But if they drop from 24 to 25, they go from a 6 seed to a 7 seed. And I'm telling you, if you're a 2 seed, that second game of the week, first opening weekend, is going to be a bear if you run into a Louisville.
Yeah, they're tough. A lot of implications out there in Charlotte this week.
And their quality of wins, they have 3 Tier 1A and 3 Tier 2A wins. So their quality speaks of a 6 seed. And you always got Nevada, Wofford, and Buffalo. Wofford loses, but they'll get in. Do they drop down to an 8 seed? I could very much see that because they didn't win the championship. If they win the championship, I think they're on the 7 seed line. That plays a role in teams like Louisville as well. What are you going to do? UCF is sitting there real close on the 8 seed line. But I don't know if there's – Louisville story is nice find there. I don't know anybody else in the ACC that really needs to cover and win a lot. I think Virginia Tech is solidly in line. Florida State solidly. Those two might be playing for a 4 or a 5, Josh, as I look at it. We have Florida State's 15 and Virginia Tech 17. So, the team that goes a little bit further might have an argument to move up or down 1 seed line.
Yeah, and so Virginia Tech, they lost, their point guard Justin Robinson. He's like the all-time assist leader at Virginia Tech, or maybe the ACC. I can't remember which one it is. I've heard he might come back, so that would play a big part. But he's been out for so long, that would be interesting to see how they.
Yeah. Didn't they beat Duke without him?
They did in Blacksburg, I believe.
So there's a situation. The guys asked the injury stuff in the chat. There's a situation where they had some nice wins before and they had some nice wins after. So you kind of just morph them together and there's really no injury report.
Right.
You just take Virginia Tech for what Virginia Tech is, obviously noting that you're going to put them a little bit higher if their guard comes back, because obviously they'll be better. The only worry there is how do you mesh them back in right away? As we've seen in the team that we follow, sometimes it's not the games you miss that are bad. Those are bad too, but it's also some of the 2 or 3 games once you come back, getting back into game shape. Again, that'll be interesting to see here with Zion and UNC Duke round 3 if it gets to be in the semifinals next Friday or this Friday night. Josh, let me go through a little bit and stop me if you have questions. We're just going to run down here a little bit as we start wrapping up. 1 seeds, I think we have 6 teams trying for or 1 seed. We talked about that here with the ACC. The big decision is Michigan, LSU, or Texas Tech for the last 2. I think Texas Tech is making a big push. If they advance and win a championship, they might sneak up to the 2 line. The 4s and 5s can be mixed. That's Kansas State, Florida State, Wisconsin, Virginia Tech, Maryland, Marquette, Auburn with good pushes. That's where you might see a flip-flop, but those teams are probably going to play each other. The big difference there is playing a 13 seed is a little bit better than playing those pesky 12 seeds. Mm-hmm. So you want to get on that 4 line. The bad thing about the 4 and 5 line is you win the first weekend, you're matched up with the 4 biggies. In that Sweet 16, but everyone will take it at that point. Our 6, 7s, and 8s are good quality teams, might move up and down from Mississippi State down to Oklahoma, Baylor. Baylor's interesting to be that high, I think, Josh, but they have 3 Tier 1A wins and 5 Tier 2A wins of their overall wins, and their losses were early, and they structured their team after some injuries. Late December, and since then, I think they've been a real solid ball club. Our 9s, we believe, are okay. We mentioned them earlier with Iowa, Minnesota, Ole Miss, and Seton Hall. When you get to the 10 line, these are teams that should want to win at least. TCU, Washington, Utah State, Syracuse, and then the bubble as we talked about. So the bracket for us has taken some form, 1 through 3, then the 4 through 5s, then the 6 through 8s, the 9s, then the 10 and 11s are sitting there. Then you got the 12s and the first 4 out. That's kind of how we're looking. Teams can move in and out of those sections based on a good run. Remember, the conference tournament might make a seed line change up 1 or down 1, but not a huge jump unless you have a team from nowhere make a huge run like Michigan a few years ago. And then the last few spots are going to be decided by the first couple of rounds. So when we start watching basketball Saturday afternoon, a lot has been decided. The teams are basically in at that point, and then it's just a matter of finalizing the bracket. Your thoughts on what we have so far? Any last questions?
Yeah, no, I love the rundown. A lot of good teams, but I think the seeding is pretty consistent with what we've seen in results this year. I'll be eager to see how the bracket reveal works, stacks up with the committee. The only question is looking at Baylor here. They're 5-2 in quad 4. So they have a quad 3 loss, 2 quad 4 losses. They're 4-8 in quad 1. So they've played well as of late, and as you said, they've kind of remade themselves. I'm kind of curious to see how the committee is really going to look at them compared to, say, an Oklahoma or an Iowa or Minnesota, some teams that are probably right there in their area. So that'll be the biggest question to me, is see how you guys and then myself look at a team like Baylor, and then how the committee looks at Baylor will be interesting.
Here's a similar comparison. In last year, Providence was 31 in the RPI, which the committee's using the net this year, but in a similar fashion. Baylor's in the 30s in net. Providence was 5-8 in quad 1, 5-2 in quad 2, 6-1 quad 3, and 5-2 in quad 4, and they were seeded 35th overall, a 9 seed. So when you look at Baylor this year, for us, they are 36, 4-8, 8-1, 2-1, 5-2. Their tier, like I said, those specialty tiers that are out 3 and 5 are close to Louisville and Ohio State worthy. They're better than Virginia Tech, better than Wisconsin, almost equal to Houston and Purdue in those top tier 1A and 2A categories. So that's why we put them in the 8 or 9 range, because they compare to what the committee's done in the past. And I think good, solid wins trump bad losses, right? And so that's what I've seen in the past. The question comes down, Arizona State, 3 quad 1 wins, 8 quad 2, 2 quad 3 losses, 2 quad 4 losses. That's why we have them in. I think their number of wins trump the bad ones. It's when you get down to you only have 2 quad 1 wins like Alabama, but you have 2 quad 3 losses that I think they cancel each other out, but there's nothing left over. I think Baylor has some leftovers after you look at their bad losses. So that's kind of why we have Baylor where they're at. But that's a good question.
Okay, good deal.
Anything else that you see that that the common person might have question with or something? Because before we started doing this, we had a ton of questions just like that. And as we dug into it, we had more and more questions. That's why Shelby Mast at the USA Today, I can't thank him enough. Bracket guy Dave Ullman from NBC Sports in Milwaukee has done a good job. Andy Bottoms from Assembly Call, all of these people, we had these questions. Why did you put Baylor as an 8? They would share with us. And so that's part of the reason why we're on Twitter so much, and part of the reason why we're trying to do these Bracket U podcasts is to give back to the bracket community. So that was a good question. Anything else catch you here before we have to sign off?
No, I was just looking, obviously, in some teams around where Indiana's at. I think if Creighton, Indiana beats Ohio State, Arizona State, St. John's, Temple, if all those teams lose early, and obviously if Ohio State loses, Indiana wins, that's going to bode well for the Hoosiers. And I think, if some of those teams lose early, then you have, say, a Belmont, and then Clemson, North Carolina State right there. It's going to be very intriguing to see how the bubble burst for teams looking at it in these metrics and just seeing the teams behind them, maybe to take advantages. But yeah, I think the field looks good right now, just with what I've seen in games that I've watched this year. So I'm ready for this weekend.
It'll be interesting, and it does bring another level of interest to the first and second rounds of these big tournaments. Before we got into this, it was always okay. I'd watch at the semifinal or championship, but now there's huge implications on getting into the tournament for North Carolina State, Clemson, Indiana, Ohio State, Temple. These first round games are very, very meaningful. So, Josh, thanks for being with us tonight. Always appreciate your input and bringing you along in the bracket world. You'll be an expert before too long. We'll have to video conference you into the morning meetings with the guys. We have a big meeting tomorrow morning. We have our final meeting Thursday night here at the house in the man cave for 3 or 4 hours to solidify the bracket after those first round games are completed. So we're excited to try to stay up in the bracket matrix. But we thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be a part of the club. I'm gonna learn a lot, and I'm gonna appreciate it and everything that you've taught me. So I hope to be. I've always wanted to be into bracketology. I've seen Lunardi on ESPN, and it's like, man, I wish I could have that job. So now I just want to be a part of your crew, and I'll do it for free.
That's great. You'll definitely be one for the years to come. So for Josh Wilson, I'm Brian Tonsoni, Delphi Bracketology. This is Sports Talk with Tonsoni. Bracket U. Happy hoops watching this week and the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a fun ride. Check back in with us at DelphiBracketology.com. Interact with us on Twitter. The handle is at Delphi Brackets. We're proud to help clear up any questions you have. So, so long. Happy hoops watching.